Welcome back to Clinical Research Training at Wake Tech. I'm Steve Pope. We're going to be talking about cleaning data, which is going to consist of writing and resolving queries in our clinical database. So cleaning data is one of the principal roles of our data management staff. And as the data comes in from sites, it's entered into the clinical database where it is subjected to the edit check process to discover errors and data discrepancies between the different data fields. So the process of cleaning this is what we're going to go over in this lecture. So the lecture is divided into two parts. Part one will be query writing. And we have a couple of learning objectives that we're going to go over. First of all, we're going to explain what a query is. Then we're going to discuss the data entry / review process. And then finally, we're going to cite the format of a query, which basically answers 4 questions: where, what, why, and how. I'll get into this in a little more detail as we move along. So let's start by talking about data. So as data comes in, we think of it as unreviewed. Now this unreviewed data is collected at sites and can be in the following examples. It could include CRF pages. It could include electronic data capture, data entries. They're going to be lab reports. They're going to be dosing diaries that patients fill out. You may have medication logs. You may have serious adverse event reports. So it can come in through a variety of different mediums. So as we've discussed earlier, for paper studies, the data is entered into the clinical database by the data management staff at the sponsor company. And for electronic data capture studies, personnel that work at the clinical sites are going to enter that data directly into the clinical database. So they'll have access to it. Then as they collect it, they'll enter it directly into the database. There's a process associated with the data entry and the data review process. And essentially it starts with the data being entered into the clinical database. So after this occurs, you have programmed edit checks that execute or they fire, and they find errors or discrepancies in the relationships between the data variables or elements. So once one of these edit checks fires, then a discrepancy appears and it's in an unreviewed status. So many of these discrepancies are reviewed manually to determine whether or not it's necessary to send them to the site for clarification. We do this because we don't want to send a whole bunch of queries to the sites that are not necessary. That tends to upset them. They don't like that very much, and then they get unhappy with us. So we're going to review these discrepancies and determine whether or not they should be sent. Every once in a while, the way the edit checks fire, you may have 3 or 4 edit checks that fire on the same discrepancy. So we don't want to send 4 different queries out to a site if we can send one and then probably close the other 3 once they respond to it. So that's the reason why we go through this review process. So after someone reviews the discrepancy and determines that it should be sent to the site, a query or a question is generated in the form of a data clarification form, and then that's what is ultimately sent to the site. So for electronic data capture studies or EDC studies, these DCFs are sent via the database, and the site user sees them the next time they log into the clinical database. On the other hand, for paper studies, the DCF form is sent to the site either through email, or it might be faxed out, or it might be sent through some other means. and then the site prints the DCF, and then they resolve it, and the principal investigator signs and dates it. And then they send it back for it to be resolved. So here's an example of a paper data clarification form. So in this case, a discrepancy is fired because it says here that inclusion criteria 9A and B have been reported as no. However, no screen fail page has been received. So if our inclusion criteria is no, then the patient should be a screen fail. So there should be a screen fail page submitted. So the site has responded back that I don't have any screen fail pages, so therefore I can't submit one. So we can probably close this and then make sure that the CRA gets some screen fail pages out to the site for them to complete. But this would be an example of a data clarification form, paper form, that goes out and then comes back, and then we review it. Here's another example of a paper CRF that was sent out to a site asking for clarification. So in this example, we have the site has reported a serious adverse event, but there's a discrepancy between the onset dates. For example, the onset date on the SAE report is recorded as 21 April 2010. However, the onset date that they recorded in the clinical database was 14 April 2010. So you can see we have a conflict there. So we've asked the site to clarify what the correct onset date is, and they've handwritten that on the DCF form, and they've clarified it as April 14th, 2010. So since we have that date recorded in our clinical database, no other action is required. So we can close that DCF, and nothing else has to be done on it. So to summarize the overall process, the data in the clinical database is continually subjected to the edit check process, and discrepancies are continually discovered throughout the trial. So as the trial progresses, fewer and fewer discrepancies are found to the point where the sponsor can declare that all discrepancies have been resolved and the data is considered clean. So at that point, the database is locked and data sets are created for analysis by the biostatistician. So one of the techniques that we use to achieve clean data is to use the query writing process. So the query writing process notifies sites of data discrepancies and asks them to clarify the data and then to resolve the query, leading to a clean data. So we send the query out to the site, they respond to it, our staff resolves it, then we close it, and we've effectively cleaned that piece of data. So one of the components in the query writing process is the edit checks that occur, that exist, that fire on data discrepancies. So these are documented in the edit specifications document. So what this document does, it documents the data review plan and specifies the consistency checks and manual checks that will support our data review efforts. It's created by a lead person in our data management group. And these programmed edit checks fall into several categories. So let me explain each one. So we have E-checks, which are non-programmed edit checks firing for missing values, and they don't carry any logic. For example, they might fire if we're supposed to record a date and we don't. We skip it, and so it's missing. So think of it as when you go to Amazon.com and you buy something on there, and you go to the checkout, you go to the little checkout cart, and it asks for your credit card number, and you try to skip over that, or maybe you don't enter in all the digits on your credit card. It won't allow you to continue until you do that. So these work in a very similar fashion. We also have what's called Q checks, which are programmed logic, and they fire as a sent DCF, so the site can view it once it fires. And these carry some logic to them. For example, they might fire if, say, for a blood pressure reading, the systolic must be greater than the diastolic. So maybe they get it backwards, they put it in backwards. Then it's going to cause an edit check to fire. And they're going to be asked to review that and possibly change their entry. We have also what's known as range checks or R checks. And that may be a range, say, for blood pressure. If we're doing a study and there's a blood pressure that's outside a certain range, we may want to have an edit check that very quickly identifies that and ask the site to clarify that that is indeed an accurate reading. The more complicated checks are the Q/M checks, and they have programmed edit check firing as a draft DCF. So they're not viewable by the site, but they're viewable by our data management team. So what we have to do on those is those require some manual review, and then if we determine that they need to be sent to the site, then we'll send them. So an example of one of those may be if an adverse event is listed on a ConMed page, but then there's no corresponding adverse event that's on the adverse event page. So there's a conflict there. So we would review those before we would send them out. And then the final category are the listings category. And so these are data review listings that are programmed in some type of data extraction tool, such as JReview or some other report writing tool that's extracting data out of our database that then someone in our data management team evaluates and reviews and determines if a query needs to be sent for further clarification. So an example of this may be a blood transfusion is more than 28 days prior to first dose. That may be something we would look for in that study, and we'd want to clarify whether or not that's occurred. So the next steps, after as we've completed the data discrepancy review process, and we've determined that the site should be sent a query or a question to clarify the data. So once we determine this, what comes next? Well, then we get into our query writing techniques. So let's talk about query writing, and let's start by talking about what's a query. Well, the simple answer is it's a question for the site to answer. So it's a question sent to the site in the form of a data clarification form, and it's asking the site to respond to the question with an answer. Now, it's important to understand that FDA regulations require that any change to data stored in a clinical database must be authorized by the site and documented using a signed and dated data clarification form. Now, in an electronic data capture system, that's done within the system itself. Only the site user would have access to a particular data field to the point where they can change that. So someone at the sponsor can't do that. Someone in some other capacity can't do it. And those are automatically date and time stamped as well as the user ID stamp. So you know which user made the change to the data. So if we're using a paper study and all of that's being done by the sponsor, then we have to have this signed data clarification form that authorizes that change. So it's very important that we understand the audit trail necessary to validate that that data is indeed accurate and correct. So why are queries necessary? Well, they're necessary because we may have conflicting data. And they're necessary because data isn't clean or available for analysis. If we have conflicts in it, we need to fix those conflicts before we can do analysis on that data. And then finally, resolution of a query can lead to more queries. So it's important that we write these in a manner where they can be easily answered by the site and resolved by our data management staff. So it's important that our query writing is done in a very clear fashion for a couple of reasons. Number one, it enables the site to clarify the data with one query. And also it reduces the need to requery a site for the same data. So if they're confused about the query, it's probably going to lead to an answer that may not be an accurate answer, or they may not even know how to answer it, which can be an even bigger problem. It also helps the site understand how to answer the query, and it just improves our overall data quality. So we need to write these in a very consistent format, which we're going to go over in just a moment. So we've talked about queries and we've talked about writing queries. So let's kind of focus on how do you write a query. The first thing we need to understand is the format of a query. So we want to tell the site in our query some specific information. First of all, we need to tell them where the discrepancy is. We need to identify what CRF page, what specific location on a CRF page, if it's not apparent. They need to understand that. We also need to let them know what the discrepancy is, what data conflicts with other data, is missing or needs to be clarified. And then third, why the discrepancy needs to be clarified. Why is it a conflict if the conflict is not apparent? And sometimes it may not be. And then finally, we want to explain to them how it should be resolved or clarified. Does the field need to be updated or not, or they need to offer some other type of clarification that satisfies us that that data is correct. So let's go over some do's and don'ts for our query writing. First of all, we want to limit our query to one question. So only one question should be answered in a query. Secondly, we want to have only one page per query. Now, an exception to this might be a query that asks the site to clarify data that might exist on a concomitant medication page, an adverse event page, or a medical history page. Say there's a query related to, say, the start date. Well, they could update any one of those three pages and therefore answer the query. But in most cases, we want to limit our query to only one specific CRF page. And then finally, we want to avoid leading queries. So we don't want to have any leading queries. And a leading query is a query that implies an expected answer. So we may word it in such a way that says, this is the answer we're seeking, and this is the one they provide. So we want to avoid that. We want them to answer honestly and accurately without our leading them in one direction or another. So let's talk about some discrepancies. So the following example is an edit check text that has fired as a result of discrepant data being entered into the clinical database. This could be entered by someone at the site for an EDC study or someone at the sponsor for a paper study. Same process occurs. So let's review our edit specifications document for a moment. We've gone over this previously. But as you can see, this is going to be in an Excel spreadsheet, and it's going to document each of the edit checks that are programmed into our database. So if we look in the first column, it's going to give us the check ID that allows us to identify it on this particular edit specifications document. It tells us what the type is, whether it's univariate, multivariate. Then it tells us which page we're going to see it fire on. There could be more than one that the check fires on. Then in the fourth column, you see variable. That's going to indicate the data variable that it applies to. And then the ones that we want to pay attention to are going to be in column 5 and 6. So in column 5, you have the rule, which indicates what the logic rule is for our edit spec, or edit check, I mean. And then just next to that is the message or the text that's going to appear for us to review, that's going to get us started in writing our query. Now, we're not going to use just that particular piece of text because we're going to massage it a little bit and kind of make sure that it's clear before we send it out. But all this information is going to be contained in our edit specifications document, and we're going to refer back to this as we go along. So we want to make sure we understand, what each of these, information is occurring in each of these, is given rather in each of these columns. So let's take a look at an example of a discrepancy. So we have, first of all, our rule, which in the example that we're going to look at is sex must have data present. So this would refer to the gender of the subject, and that has to be present, say, on a demographic page. And then the message that pulls in that we're going to work from is a value for sex is missing, please provide. So let's look at another example. In this example, the edit check that's fired has the following rule. If ongoing box is checked, end of therapy must be blank. And you see the variables there that check is firing against. So then the message that comes in says concomitant medication blank is documented. However, end date, it gives us a variable, and ongoing are both present. Please clarify. So if we look here in our message, so the first thing that's happening, that message is, the message text is pulling in, and then you can see that first variable, the CTS EQNO, that refers to the concomitant medication number that corresponds from the concomitant medication page, and that's pulling in, and then the variable just next to that, CONRX, is the name of that medication. So it may indicate concomitant medication to, ibuprofen is documented. However, an end date and ongoing are both present. So that's where your conflict occurs. So we want them to clarify that. Is there an end date? Is it ongoing? It's got to have one or the other, so they can't both be present. So we need to clarify, the site needs to clarify which one is correct. So let's go back to our first example. The first example in our rule is that sex must have data present, and then the text that pulls into that is the value for sex is missing, please provide. So now we're ready to write this query and send it to the site. So we want to tell them where is the discrepancy. It occurs on the demographic page. We want to tell them what the discrepancy is. A value for sex is missing. Then we want to tell them why does it need to be clarified. A value must be entered for sex for each patient. And then how should it be resolved? They should provide the value. So here's how we would write that query. So we see the rule, we see the message. Now we're going to massage the message text, and it's going to say on demographic page 1, 2, 3, whichever page that is, an entry for sex is missing. Please update or clarify otherwise. There's nothing leading about that query. We're just asking them to clarify what the sex of the subject is. So let's take a look at our second example. You see the rule that pulled in, ongoing box is checked, end of therapy must be blank. And then you see the message that comes in. So once again, where is the discrepancy? It's on the ConMed page, a line number, and the name of the ConMed. We want to have that information in our query. What is the discrepancy? Ongoing box is checked, but end date is not blank. So in other words, they put an end date in there and they check the ongoing box. So they can't have both. That's a conflict. Why does it need to be clarified? Ongoing cannot be checked if an end date is not blank. And then how is it to be resolved? They should update the page and resolve the conflict. So they should be able to either turn off the check for ongoing, leave the end date, delete the end date, leave the check for ongoing, whichever way is correct. But we need for them to clarify that. So in our second example, here's how we're going to write out our query. You see the rule, you see the message that pulled in. So here's our final text. On concomitant medication page, blank, line blank, we'll include the medication name. Ongoing is checked. However, end date of whatever that end date is, we're going to include that, is present. Please clarify. And that's it. They're going to indicate what the clarification is and they're going to fix it. So the next thing we're going to do is a query writing exercise. And before we get into that, let's review what we want to do with our queries. We want to tell the site where is the discrepancy, what CRF page, what specific location, what the discrepancy is, what data conflicts with other data is missing or needs to be clarified. We want to indicate why the discrepancy needs to be clarified, why it's a conflict, and then finally how it should be resolved. So with that in mind, I want you to pull up the query writing exercise on Moodle. Go ahead and print that out, and when you do, you're going to see this page that comes up. So what we've got here in our first column, or in the second column, we've got query text that pulls in from the edit spec. So you can see what those are. So what I want you to do is in the second column indicate, should we send it to the site? Do we need to modify that? What do we need to do on it? So if we look at the first one, we have a value for QT/QT interval is missing. Please provide. So we want to indicate where it is, what it is, why, and how. So the items that you see, the text that you see in bold indicates the data that pulls in from the database fields. So for example, if we look at number 2, our text that pulls in says page 404, electrocardiogram, date performed is 21 August 2013. That documents QTC interval of 460 milliseconds. It's out of range. However, this is not documented as a serious adverse event and/or study termination was not done. So please clarify or provide. So what I want you to do is make sure that that query is adequate to send to the site, or do we need to not send it to the site? So you can just handwrite that in the column to the left. The next one on down says page 103, line 1, Zoloft. Patient is taking medication/medications that are not allowed in this trial. Please discontinue study medication and complete trial discontinuation, page 801. Otherwise, please clarify. Should we send that? Should we not send that? You'll have about 10 or 12 examples here. I want you to go through those. Once we get to our resolution part, we're going to resolve these, and it will start to make a lot more sense to you. So now that you've done your query writing exercise and you've reviewed the answers that I provided for that, let's take a look at part 2 of our lecture, which is going to be query resolution. Query resolution occurs after the sites respond to the queries with their answers and their clarifications. So for EDC studies, these clarifications are made as updates to the clinical data directly in the database, and if necessary, or the site responds to the data that the data is correct as is and no updates have been made. So for paper studies, the process is a little bit different. They respond to the paper DCFs by writing their response on the DCF itself, having the principal investigator date and sign it, and then send it back to the sponsor, usually either via fax or an email. And then at that point, then the data is corrected in the database by someone on the data management staff for the sponsor. So for query resolution, our learning objectives are to cite the steps involved in resolving queries, and then we're going to discuss the actions involved in the resolution process. So let's talk about the first steps that we take in the query resolution process. The first thing we do is we want to read and understand the discrepancy. The reason we want to do this is because many times we're going to be resolving queries that we didn't write ourselves, and we may not be fully familiar with them. So we want to read and understand the discrepancy first and make sure we understand it. We also want to carefully read the site's response. And when we read the site's response, we want to consider the following questions. Does their response answer the question? Does their response make sense? Does the response raise another question that we then need to issue another query for? And then finally, is the data clarification form signed and dated by the appropriate personnel? So those are the questions we want to answer as we're resolving those queries. So once we've answered those questions, so what answer or what action do we take after answering the preceding questions? Well, for EDC studies, we want to check the database to ensure that the site made the change that they said that they made, if there is one. It's very annoying when the site responds, data corrected or data changed, and then we go in and we look and we discover that they didn't really make a change. So, and that happens. So we got to make sure that they actually made the change that they claimed that they made. So for paper studies, the process is similar. We want to, first of all, based on their response, we want to update the database first. Then we're going to annotate the CRF page because it's going to be in paper with the updated change, if there is one. And then what's important is to include the DCF number to any change that we make to the database and to the CRF page. This provides an audit trail so it's clear who made the change and when it was made. So we need that because, as we said earlier, FDA requirements require us to indicate who made a change, the date it was made, and what the change was to any data field in our database. So the next step that we do is we want to indicate what the change was and its location for any EDC study. So we'll include that in the DCF form as we're resolving it. For paper studies, we want to annotate the data clarification form indicating what the change was and its location, or if a requery was necessary. And once we've done that, then we're ready to close our DCF and the discrepancy. Now, in some databases, these may be the same. In others, they may be different. They may have a separate discrepancy database that's different from the DCF database. Oracle Clinical, for example, does that. Some of the other databases, actually, the two are really combined into the same thing. So we want to close both if both exist. But at the very least, we're going to close our DCF to indicate that we've resolved it, we've closed it, and it's resolved to our satisfaction. Then our final step, once we've accomplished those preceding steps, is we want to push that data clarification through the workflow so that it has a resolved status. Now this may differ from sponsor to sponsor based on what tools they use. But in most cases, you're going to have some sort of workflow where that gets reviewed by a second person to determine if it should be set for resolved. So we'll normally go ahead and push that through so that it can be second pass reviewed. So let's take a look at some query resolution examples. You'll see these are familiar to the ones that we used in our query writing exercise. So if you see on your screen, we have a paper data clarification form that we've received back from the site. And so we have three different components to that. The first is the problem, the second is the site's response, and then finally is the signature block for the principal investigator to sign along with the date in which they signed it. So in this example, our problem or our query was we had on demographic page 3 an entry for sex is missing. Please update or clarify otherwise. So the site has responded back that the subject is male. And you can see where the principal investigator signed it down at the bottom. They signed on 30 November 2013. So we can probably begin to resolve that. So if we we think about the questions that we had first, we see that we see the response makes sense. They answered the question, they signed and dated it. So we should be in pretty good shape on that particular query that we received back. So here's another example that we looked at earlier. Our problem is that on concomitant medication page 101, line 5, losartan, ongoing is checked. However, end date of 11 September 2013 is present. So please clarify. Then the site has responded back, medication is ongoing. Please delete end date of 11 September 2013. So if it's ongoing, we won't have an end date. So someone there at the sponsor is going to update our database to delete that end date. And then as you can see, the principal investigator signed and dated it at the bottom. So it looks like we're probably in pretty good shape on this resolution as well. So let's take a look at another example. In this example, we have concomitant medication page 103, line 1, lists Zoloft. However, Zoloft is on the disallowed medications list. Please confirm that patient is currently taking or has previously taken Zoloft or clarify otherwise. And we've even indicated down below that for the site to list the start and end date for Zoloft. So the site has responded back. Their response says, I don't have a list of disallowed medications. And they responded, the PI signed it, and they dated it. So does their response make sense? Well, no, not really. It could be true that they don't have a disallowed medications list, but we can't close this because their response doesn't really make any sense. So we probably need to alert the CRA that's responsible for that site and make sure that they get a copy of the disallowed medications list. But they still need to go back and resolve this one way or the other. They've got to provide start and end dates or clarify whether or not the subject is still on this medication. So this is going to result in some type of requery. So here's another example that we want to go over. In this DCF, it says adverse event page 204 was submitted with all the rows filled. However, a new adverse event page was not submitted. Please submit adverse event page 204 even if it is blank. So the sites responded that adverse event page 205 will be submitted. Now, as you might imagine, we actually made an error in our query here. We should have listed please submit adverse page 205 even if it's blank. But the site sort of understood what we meant And so they responded back that adverse event page 205 will be submitted. And the PI signed it and dated it at the bottom. Now, the first thing we want to do before we close this is we need to go in and look and make sure they submitted that page. If they have not, then we can't close this. So we would probably want to maybe put this DCF on hold maybe for a few days and check it later to make sure that they actually submitted it before we close it. So that may be the course of action that we have to take. If we've discovered that they haven't submitted it, then we probably are going to have to requery this and ask them to submit it to remind them. And this will happen. Sites will respond back and they'll say, and their response makes sense, and they say they're going to do something, but then we can't just take their word for it that they're going to do it. We have to actually look and make sure that they did it before we close this. So here's another example of a query that we got back from the site. So it says, concomitant medication page 104, line 2, lists Xanax with action taken with study drug as, quote, permanently discontinued. However, no stop date was recorded on the study dosing page. Please update the appropriate ECRF page or clarify otherwise. So the site has responded back that says Xanax stop date is 22 August 2013. Principal investigator signed and dated at the bottom. Does this resolve this query? No, it doesn't, because although their response sort of makes sense, we're not asking them to provide us a start date for Xanax. We're asking them to provide us the date of the last dose of the study medication. The study medication is not Xanax. So although they provided an answer, we need to requery this and imply that we want them to tell us what the date of last dose was for Xanax, because they've indicated that it was permanently, or excuse me, for the study drug, because they've indicated that it was permanently discontinued, but they've provided no start date on the study dosing page. So they need to provide some clarification on that. So in some of the preceding queries, you've seen where the site responded, but their answer either didn't make sense or they didn't actually answer the question that we asked them to answer. So in this case, we have to issue a requery. So there are a couple steps that we go through to accomplish this. So if we need to requery a previous query, in our text, we want to thank the site for their response. And then we also want to include the DCF number and their response so that they know they can very quickly match up the two. We want to restate the original query so that the site can answer or provide further clarification. And then once we've done that and we've sent it out to the site, we're going to close the original DCF or the discrepancy. And we're going to reference the requery DCF number so that someone that comes back and reviews that 6 months or a year from now can say, well, they closed that and they requeried it on this particular query number. So let's go back to the example that we had earlier with the medication Xanax. So here's a copy of the DCF that we got back from the site. So as you can see, our DCF number is 22045, and it says concomitant medication page 104, line 2, lists Xanax with action taken with study drug as, quote, permanently discontinued. However, no stop date was recorded on the study dosing page. Please update the appropriate ECRF page or clarify otherwise. So the site's response was Xanax stop date was 22 August 2013. However, that's not the question we asked them. So they didn't answer the question that we actually asked them. So we're going to requery this. So the language below is what we're going to put in our requery. So one of the first things we do, we're going to thank them for their response. Thank you for the response to DCF 22045 of and then we put their response in quotes. Xanax stop date was 22 August 2013. However, more clarification is needed. So then we're going to restate the original query so that they see that, and you can see that's the same as it is on the first query. Then we're going to ask them to please update the appropriate ECRF page or clarify otherwise. So we've done the three things. We thanked them for their response. We told them what their response was, and we've provided the DCF number. And then we restated our query and asked for further clarification. So hopefully this time they'll understand that their original response didn't answer the question that we asked them. So now that we've gone through our query resolution process, one thing that we want to talk about is related to paper studies. We will have what's called on-site data clarification forms. So what these are written by monitors, by CRAs that go on site and monitor the site's activity. And then normally what will happen is that they'll write up these queries and then they'll hand them to the site staff. The site will answer them. They'll get the PI to sign them, and then they'll hand them back to the monitor, and the monitor can review them and resolve them on site there. Generally for a paper study, these are going to be returned to the sponsor or the CRA, or excuse me, the CRO. And then it goes through the same process as you would use for resolving a paper DCF. So the very same workflow will exist for these as well. For EDC studies, it's not necessary to do this because monitors can issue queries directly in the database that the site then answers and responds to, and then the CRA or the monitor can go in and close those if they're satisfied with the site's response. So now that we've gone over how to resolve queries, we're going to complete our query resolution exercise. So I'm going to give you some queries that we've received back from the sites along with their responses. And you're going to determine what the next step is. Should you close them? Do they need to be requeried? All that good stuff. So let's take a look at the page. You'll find this page in the subject or in the on Moodle for this week. You'll be able to print those out. It's probably about 3 pages, and then you'll see the messages there along with the site's response. And then in the third column, just indicate what action should be taken in order to resolve it. So remember the questions that we have to answer. So we've gotten their response back. Does it answer the question? Does their response make sense? Does their response prompt another question? And was it signed and dated by the appropriate site personnel? In this case, the PI, the principal investigator, would need to sign and date that. So you'll see that these queries are very similar to some of the ones that we've been looking at in our training. So I don't think you'll have a whole lot of difficulty with that. And then I'll post the responses to those online later this week. And then finally, after you've completed your query writing and query resolution exercises, your reading assignment for the week will be to read Chapter 8, which is Cleaning Data in Practical Guide to Clinical Data Management. And then on the discussion board, answer the following questions. So based on your reading assignment and what you've learned in class, explain the importance of accurate query writing and resolution, and explain at least 2 consequences that can result from inaccurate or careless query writing and resolution. So I want you to think about that, compose your response, go ahead and get it out there later this week, and then I'll be taking a look and reviewing those and providing some comments. Let me know if you have questions, but I don't think you'll have any difficulty completing that.